Good evening. My name is Jason Wallace. I'm the pastor of Christ Presbyterian Church, and we welcome you to another installment of the Ancient Paths. We are privileged to have with us this evening Jason Cooperrider. He is the co-founder of SHIFT, a student group up at the University of Utah focused on atheism. SHIFT stands for Secular Humanism, Inquiry, and Free Thought. He is also a board member of the Humanist of Utah and a board member of the Utah Coalition for Reason. It is that group that has put up the billboard on Highway 201 that is basically putting forth a challenge, saying that if you don't believe in God, you're not alone. And so that billboard went up a few weeks ago, or a couple of months ago now, I guess. And anyway, we invited Mr. Cooperrider to come on the show, and he has been very gracious to join us. Mr. Cooperrider, very good to have you with us.
It's nice to be here. Thank you.
I'm curious, what's the motive in the Utah Coalition of Reasons putting that billboard up?
Well, I think the message is pretty straightforward. We wanted to let other non-theists in Utah know that they're not alone, and there are other like-minded people around the state, and they're welcome to come see what we're about.
Now, I'm curious because in the conversation that we had before, the atheists here in Utah, there's a spectrum of them, aren't there, in terms of the reasons they've come to atheism and also how they defend their atheism?
Certainly, I'd say that's true of any area. There's a spectrum.
You particularly have come to a position that's not exactly popular among many atheists, that there really is no objective morality that an atheist can claim, is there?
Well, I'm not sure it's accurate to say that it's unpopular, but I would say that's my position, yes.
Are you familiar with the new atheist? People like Sam Harris, Richard Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens, the men who have been very popular over the last few years in terms of promoting a new atheism. They tend to present their case against religion, and Christianity in particular, in terms of a good versus evil. Mm-hmm. We have a few quotes here. Sam Harris said, "If I could wave a magic wand and get rid of either rape or religion, I would not hesitate to get rid of religion." It's not simply a matter that he philosophically disagrees with the arguments for theism, but he believes it's evil. Another quote from Sam Harris: "Some propositions are so dangerous that it may even be ethical to kill people for believing them." And then we also have a quote from Richard Dawkins, a famous one, at least among Christians. He says in his book, The God Delusion, he says, "The God of the Old Testament is arguably the most unpleasant character in all fiction, jealous and proud of it, a petty, unjust, unforgiving control freak, a vindictive, bloodthirsty ethnic cleanser, a misogynistic, homophobic, racist, infanticidal, genocidal, filicidal, pestilential, megalomaniacal, sadomasochistic, capriciously malevolent bully." One of the frustrating things for theists and Christians in particular in terms of these kinds of arguments is trying to get these new atheists to give a reasonable basis of their own morality. They seem to just simply make gratuitous assertions that, of course, there's an objective morality because it's just obvious. Now, you're a board member. You're pursuing your PhD in neuroscience at the University of Utah. Do you think that that's a reasonable thing to say? That there's an objective basis of morality that atheists and theists should readily admit to?
Well, I think in atheism or naturalism, which would be a term I would prefer in this situation, I don't think there can be an objective basis for morality. I do think there has to be some sort of an outside force or creator, such as God, in order for there to be an objective morality. Just to clarify a few points, though, I would say it might be inaccurate to say that the new atheist movement or the new atheists would call religion evil, per se. I think there are those who would argue that it does have negative effects, and certainly there are some who would say evil. I think you can't say that for everyone, though.
Honestly, so much of what I hear, I think spurred on by Dawkins and others, comes across as the kind of fundamentalism that people often identify with Christians. You know, this sort of unself-reflective, screaming louder and louder when they're challenged to defend their position. We had a debate with a mutual friend of ours, Mark Howsam, and there was a young woman that was at the Humanist of Utah table, and there was a brochure that said, I think it was something along the lines, "We welcome our heretics, we don't burn them." And I made a comment. I said, you know, what about Stalin? What about the Khmer Rouge? You know, what about these others? And she became very indignant and just kept getting louder and louder. And I tried to calmly point out that she was holding a double standard. During the question period of the debate, she got up and her comment, we have it actually on film, she said, I'm outraged. This man in the back told me I was wrong, and it's wrong to tell people they're wrong." And it's like, wait a minute. If it's wrong to tell people they're wrong, then aren't you wrong? I think there really is a great deal of anger on the part of many atheists. Now, maybe these are the ones that are more visible, but I mean, is this something that you see a great deal of, or is this something that's more the exception rather than the rule?
I would say it certainly exists. I'm not going to deny that. I will say it's probably a minority. I'm not going to guess at what percentage of atheists feel that way. And within the atheist community, we tend to refer to that group as anti-theist. And I don't come across too many who self-identify as anti-theist. Certainly, I have heard the opinions of some talking about how religion is a negative force and is something that shouldn't be encouraged, and some might even say eradicated. It's the position of Shift, at least, and many of the organizations here in Utah that theists are welcome and are engaged in civil dialogue, and we don't say that you shouldn't be religious and we don't want you around because you're religious, or we think you should be put to death because you're religious. So,
well, I do have to qualify what I said earlier. I mean, I think that this is a position that you run into a lot, especially in terms of young, angry men. It seems that you get a lot of that in terms of people who they're rebelling against their upbringing or something like this, and they seem to carry a chip on their shoulder towards religion in general. But at the same time, the Humanist of Utah, of which you're a board member, I don't know if you were around when we co-sponsored a debate together. No. We had Mark Howsam, a ruling elder in our congregation, debate Dr. Keller. Mark's got his doctorate in the meantime, but Dr. Keller from down at UVU, about whether whether there could be an objective morality or not. And there have been some other things. I know that Mark's been involved with Shift in terms of some things, and so it's encouraging. I mean, what we try to do on this show is to have some respectable dialogue, but honestly, guys like Dawkins and Harris, they seem to just be mocking and shouting louder and louder and ignoring the people who challenge their presuppositions. But let's focus on an objective morality. It's my contention as a Christian that atheists really can't have an objective morality. They can't say that something is absolutely wrong because there is some fixed standard by which to judge it. Instead, all they can do is say, well, I feel a certain way, or a group of us feel a certain way. Would that approximate what you would say?
I think so, yes. I think, at least it's my position that, as I said, you do have to have God or some creative force in order to have an objective morality. And in the absence of an objective morality, which would be the naturalistic or an atheist viewpoint thereby, you couldn't say something is absolutely right or absolutely wrong.
To me, this is striking because I'm beginning to hear this admitted in quarters that I wouldn't have expected before. Joel Marks, Professor Emeritus of Philosophy at University of New Haven in Connecticut, in an edition of Philosophy Now, a periodical, last year published an amoral manifesto. And it seems like he's at least going down the same general road as you. I'd like to share a few quotes with you.
Sure.
He says, first of all, these are a few snippets. The long and short of it is that I became convinced that atheism implies amorality. And since I am an atheist, I must therefore embrace amorality. A little later, he argues for what he calls hard atheism. And he contrasts that with soft atheism. And he says, analogously, a soft atheist would hold that one could be an atheist and still believe in morality. And indeed, the whole crop of new atheists, he's speaking there of Dawkins and company, are softies of this kind. So was I, until I experienced my shocking epiphany that the religious fundamentalists are correct. Without God, there is no morality. But they are incorrect, I still believe, about there being a God. Hence, I believe there is no morality. And then finally, one more quote from him, just to give you a sense of his presentation. He says, but the problem with morality, I now maintain, is that it is in even worse shape than religion in this regard. For if there were a God, his issuing commands would make some kind of sense. But if there is no God, as of course atheists assert, then what sense could be made of there being commands of this sort? In sum, while theists take the obvious existence of moral commands to be the kind of proof of the existence of a commander, i.e. God, I now take the non-existence of a commander as a kind of proof that there are no commands, i.e. morality. Now, understanding that he argues later on for a subjective personal morality in terms of personal desires, would you agree with him?
I do agree with Marx in his essay that you're talking about. I think it's important to understand that atheism in itself has nothing to say about morality. It's simply the lack of belief in a deity. So that's what belief systems such as humanism are for, where a group of individuals who share a common morality can agree on what they think is right or wrong and pursue those morals.
I'm curious, now obviously you're speaking for yourself, and I know that on the board of these organizations would be people who would disagree with these positions, or would assume that there probably are. But would you go so far as to say that the people who make these assertions that there are morality, they're just being inconsistent? They're not recognizing the logical consequence of their own position?
I think that's certainly likely to be the case in some instances. I think I know there are a few individuals I've discussed this with, and Mark Howsom's discussed this with in the past from Shift, who actually have put a lot of thought into it and have come to an opposing viewpoint. So I don't think it's the case in all instances that they're being logically inconsistent. And I think we have to realize we're all human. We have different viewpoints about things, and we're going to disagree on varying points. And I think this issue is a good illustration of that.
So I'm curious, let's look at some of the major moral questions that generally arise. One that's often put forward in these kinds of discussions, one that people like Dawkins try to pin on Christians, even though Hitler mocked Christianity. Politically, he came to some accords with the Vatican, but he also made statements that he clearly rejected historic religion. I mean, basically trying to create some almost Nietzsche-like cult, but that's another story. But what about the Holocaust? From an atheistic perspective, what can you say about something like that? Can you make any judgments that it was either wrong or right, and by whose standard?
Sure. Well, from an atheist position, there's really nothing that could be said about that. You can have your own subjective moral viewpoints about that, and you can be in a group of people, such as humanists, who would share an equal disdain for an event like that. But as I said, atheism says nothing about morality on its own.
So personally, you may have a disdain for it, but do you have any basis on which to support it or to oppose it?
Objectively, in my viewpoint, no.
Okay, well, subjectively.
Subjectively, you can say that it doesn't align with your desires, or you desire that there not be a Holocaust, so you're opposed to the Holocaust, or your desires oppose the killing of human beings based on their religion or belief, and you'd be opposed to the Holocaust in that situation.
But it's just but it has no deeper significance than the fact that you might like chocolate versus vanilla.
Well, I don't think that necessarily means that the viewpoint is any better or worse or valid or invalid. It's just based on subjective morality.
I'm curious, Dr. Keller, when we co-sponsored the debate years ago, and you weren't there, so I mean, it's a little, I'll qualify it appropriately since you weren't there. I asked him the question. He was trying to assert that if a community sets standards, that should be respected. And I raised the question, well, what about Germany? Hitler was popularly elected. When Hitler was killing the useless eaters, as they were referred to here in America, he was praised in the New York Times. This is prior to the outbreak of World War II. He was pursuing a Darwinist perspective in terms of survival of the fittest. He was euthanizing, which was a term they created, giving a good death to the chronically infirmed, to the mentally ill, to people that were considered to be an unnecessary drag on society. This was viewed as eugenics, a proper view of Darwinism, carrying Darwinism to its conclusion. Is there any basis on which to say that that's not proper?
Well, like I said, you can really only make that assertion based on your own subjective morality and the subjective morality of the group that you might identify with. Objectively, no. You couldn't make that assertion.
Then what, I'm not trying to be confrontational here, but I'm curious, what's the point of making subjective judgments if they're not based on anything other than your feelings? I mean, if I feel differently, if I'm a Darwinist and I believe that a baby girl born with a club foot, seriously club foot is going to be a drag on society, and I think that it's a good thing just to suffocator. You have no basis on which to say that that's wrong. You just have a basis on which to say you don't like that, right?
Well,
I mean, what's the point of a personal morality?
well, first of all, I want to say that you're saying that would be the position of a Darwinist, whereas I don't see the term Darwinist having anything to do with the type of utilitarian ethics you're talking about necessarily.
Well, in terms of Margaret Sanger, in terms of the self-described eugenics movements of the 20s and 30s, weren't they arguing from explicitly Darwinist perspectives?
They may very well have been influenced by some Darwinist perspective, as you call it. I don't think you can necessarily say that's the primary basis of their belief system or their morality. I think, as I've said, it's largely based on their own subjective morality, and you're asking whether or not that has any merit, a morality that's based on your desires or feelings about something, if there's no objective viewpoint to say it's right or wrong. And I think there is merit to that, because if you want your society to exceed, which is in the best interest of the individuals in that society.
But isn't that that's a value judgment based on what?
Well, succeeding, society succeeding isn't necessarily a value judgment.
Well, I mean, succeeding in their stated goals, but who says that those goals are worth succeeding in, that it's actually moving something forward?
Well, that would be the opinion of the group of individuals that make up that society.
Okay, well, in Germany, they decided that the chronically infirm should be killed.
Okay.
You as an individual, how can you posit your personal feelings against the feelings of millions?
Well, just because there might be a minority of some subjective morality doesn't mean it's invalid in comparison to the majority subjective morality.
But there's no standard of judgment, is there?
There wouldn't be. There would be no outside observer saying the majority party is right or wrong compared to the minority party and their views.
So I'm curious, do you support walls?
Sure.
Why?
Well, they help keep order in society.
Why?
Well, in order for society to succeed and prosper.
But by whose standard?
By the standard of the individuals that comprise that society.
If you would agree that atheists are a minority.
Oh, certainly, particularly in the United States.
Yeah. If the majority decides that, let me qualify this carefully, there are a lot of people looking for quotes out of context. If a theistic majority decided that we should either expel or kill atheists, then you have no real basis on which to oppose that, do you?
Well, fortunately, a democracy would not really allow for something like that. If the U.S. were a theocracy, certainly something like that could happen.
Well, why not in a democracy? I mean, democracies have done. I mean, as I said, Hitler was democratically elected, and they chose minorities that they chose to kill. So, I mean, that wasn't a theocracy in the sense that you're describing. It was a democracy.
I don't know how many people would argue that the German system of government at that time was a democracy, even in the presence of elections, given the nature of Hitler and his rise to power. It's a completely different scenario from what we would have in the modern U.S.
Well, Soviet Union. I mean, Cambodia, the Khmer Rouge. There have been a host of examples. Rwanda, you had a majority of the people that voted in leaders who wanted to subjugate, if not kill, a minority within that country. So how is a democracy immune from this? It's the majority picking on the minority. How is that any different from?
Well, I think in situations like those, you have to consider the global context, in which the global society would then be a collective of subjective values and consider the majority or minority views of the global population. The global population majority would be opposed to such events and would intercede.
You sure?
Well, it's happened in the past. Certainly, sometimes it takes a while for intercession to occur, and sometimes it doesn't. But that's what you have to consider in contexts like that.
From a Darwinist perspective, Darwin's Descent of Man. From his book, Descent of Man, and there are a host of other books that have followed along this line. Huxley, I think, has followed some of this, and others. They argued that evolution has been corrupted by religion, and that we need to get rid of religion for evolution to continue to move forward, because we're allowing we're in the name of charity feeding the non-fit. We're allowing, Darwin was very specific in Descent of Man, that we're allowing less evolved races, as he would term it. I'm not advocating this, but we're allowing them to multiply faster than civilized folks. Darwin had very clear ideas of objective morality. How do you distinguish yourself from that?
Well, I would say the majority of atheists wouldn't equate charity or helping the less fortunate with stalling human evolution necessarily.
But isn't that what Darwin argued in Descent of Man?
I can't make any claim about that. I'm not sure.
Okay. It's what the eugenics folks would have clearly argued. Would you agree with that?
Well, I can't say I would be surprised that some group of people might take Darwin's ideas and come up with something like that. Human beings are notorious for using past philosophies to justify their actions and beliefs.
I want to continue fleshing out your position, because I think it's fascinating, especially in light of the new atheist. But I want to go ahead and open up the phone lines. If you'd like to join in the conversation, our phone number here is 801-973-TV20. That's 801-973-8820. We have with us Jason Cooper-Ryder. He is a board member of the Humanists of Utah and the Utah Coalition of Reason. They are the ones who have sponsored the billboard that has been put up on State Route 201 promoting atheism, saying if you don't believe in God, you're not alone, or something fairly close to that. So if you'd like to join in, 801-973-8820. I'd like to shift the ground a little bit, because I think we've covered this. But if there's no objective basis on which to know what's right in terms of morality, then on what basis do you have a certainty that there is no God? I assume that you describe yourself as an atheist, correct?
Yes.
An agnostic, it was Huxley who invented that term, right? Thomas Huxley?
I'm not certain.
An agnostic would say, I'm not convinced by the evidence, but I reserve judgment. But you're stating that you definitely believe there is no God.
No, I'm not stating that at all.
Okay. Could you qualify your position, please?
Certainly. And in fact, I call myself technically an agnostic atheist. The term atheist simply means that I lack a belief in God, not necessarily that I believe that God does not exist. So I call myself an agnostic atheist because I lack a belief in God, and that's because I think there isn't sufficient empirical evidence to warrant that belief. That's where agnostic comes in, but I don't make any definite claims about the existence of God.
Did you grow up in any kind of religion?
Yes, I did. So I was raised Christian, My grandparents took me to a Lutheran church until I was about 12 years old.
Okay. Was that do you know, was it the mainline ELCA or the more conservative Missouri Synod, or?
I don't know. I didn't even know there was a difference until a few years ago. So.
Okay, so you grew up in Ohio.
Yes.
You went to church till you were 12.
Mm-hmm.
What led you to atheism?
Well, I've always been a very questioning child, I guess you could say. I sat down and asked my mother all in one go when I was, 6 years old, whether Santa Claus, the Easter Bunny, and the Tooth Fairy were real. Got the answers to that, and I just abandoned Christianity in high school after thinking a lot about it. And then early on in college, I abandoned theism altogether after giving a lot of thought to it.
I'm curious, a lot of teenage boys in particular, I know there are girls as well, and this is a bit of a stereotype, but it's one that has its basis in reality. A lot of teenage boys, they get into high school and they embrace atheism because basically there's no one to tell them that anything they choose to do is wrong. They find it very liberating that they can pursue whatever pleasures that are out there and feel no guilt. But if there's no objective basis for morals, not only is there nothing bad, but there's also nothing good, is there?
No punishment or reward as far as that coming from some creator or deity, yes.
But also, you know, I've spoken with atheists that they are pursuing, I mean, like yourself, you're pursuing rigorous studies, you're pursuing a PhD in neuroscience. Why?
Well, that's what interests me, and I just find the brain fascinating, and it's my goal to make the world a better place through science.
Well, but that's a value judgment that's simply based on your own feelings.
That's right.
And you have no basis on which to say that someone who's trying to bring about Sharia law and the triumph of Islam through blowing up buildings, you have no basis on which to say that they're not trying to make the world a better place either, do you?
Not objectively, no.
The question I've got is, so many times when I ask people, you know, why they do the things they do, well, it makes me feel good. But it seems to be an incomplete answer because drugs will make you feel good. Why get up in the morning? Why bother to do these things? Can you give me an objective answer to that?
Not objectively. Again, it's subjective. If you think life is worth living and being happy doing what you think is right is worth living for, then that's the reason for it.
Now, you're pursuing a PhD in neuroscience. Aren't there drugs that can make you feel that way too, without all the work?
I wouldn't go to that extent. Certainly they can induce feelings of euphoria and whatnot, but I don't think you can say that it would bring about such reasoning as that.
Albert Camus was a French existentialist philosopher. If I remember my history correctly, he essentially tries to argue for existentialism, that he understands that if there is no God, then there is no purpose. There's no real past. There's no real future. And there's no real present. But he tried to argue that by existentialism we can derive value and meaning through our actions. But it ended up being hollow, and he drove his car into a wall at 120 miles an hour and killed himself. What would you tell someone who says, you know, I'm an atheist. I don't believe that there's a God. I don't believe that there's right or wrong. I don't believe there's any reason for me to bother getting up in the morning. I'm going to kill myself. I'm tired of living in a world full of people that are killing each other, lying, stealing, raping. I'm tired of everyone fussing at me. I'm tired of getting sick and weak and all like that. I'm just going to die. Do you have any basis on which to tell them to do otherwise?
Well, I would probably tell him or her that there is a group of people, the humanists, who do advocate for making the world a better place and hopefully alleviating some of these reasons that he or she would want to kill himself or not live for in the first place.
But he tells you that we and all we do are nothing more than food for the worms, so why bother?
Well, with a position like that, I don't think there's too much you can do to argue against it. If the person's subjective values are so far outweighed by all these negative aspects of life, then there wouldn't be a lot you could say to convince the person otherwise.
I don't know if you recognize, I'm quoting from the Dead Poets Society.
No, I don't.
That was a Robin Williams film where he portrays a prep school teacher that tells the boys, we and all we do are nothing more than food for the worms. Therefore, carpe diem, seize the day. And it's a logical leap, isn't it? Why seize the day? I mean, one of the interesting things in the film is that one of his students follows this very romantic notion that I'm going to make my own reality, and it comes crashing down around him and he kills himself. Why seize the day? If we and all we do are nothing more than food for the worms, why bother?
Well, again, if you think your subjective values are worth continuing to live for and feeling that happiness that you get from pursuing them, then that would be the motivation for continuing to live.
How old are you, Jason?
26.
Okay, you're 26 years old. Do you know many people who have been able to maintain this kind of philosophy that I'm going to keep doing what I'm doing, even though I don't believe there's any objective basis? I'm going to keep doing it because it makes me feel good. Have there been many people who've maintained that over a lifetime?
Well, about 7 billion currently. They're still alive.
7 billion, no, I'm saying holding to an atheistic position.
An atheistic position.
That they and all they do are food for the worms, which would be a Darwinistic perspective, right?
Well, I can't say that's a very popular viewpoint that I've come across, because having that viewpoint that there's really no meaning to life is one that's difficult to maintain, as you're getting at.
It seems there's this romantic leap among many atheists. I mean, Gene Roddenberry, we were talking Star Trek beforehand.
Sure.
Yes, I am a geek, I admit it. I'm not going to hide from that.
Ditto.
You know, in Star Trek, there is this atheism which seems drawn towards this idea that there are no objective standards, and yet you see these romantic leaps all the time. You seem to be more of a fan of Voyager than I ever was. The mysticism that they introduced into there, I think, is a symptom of that. I mean, would you agree that there is this irrational romanticism that says, okay, all we are is lucky mud. You know, we're just complex. There's nothing intrinsically different from us and a worm other than complexity. We're not going anywhere. We're not going to do anything, but we're still going to make this romantic leap and try to act as if there is something. That's not a very tenable position, logically, is it?
Well, I think a lot of atheists have the position that you can derive meaning in life without, even in the absence of an objective morality or the existence of a creator who would give an afterlife or whatnot. And thereby you should live the life you do have, for however long you have it, the best you can. Make the most of it.
But once again, we come back to why.
And that all...
Why, I'm curious. It seems as if there's almost an evangelistic streak that would lead you to put a billboard up on Highway 201.
I think the purpose of the billboard might have been misinterpreted. I remember you said earlier that it was to promote atheism. That actually wasn't the purpose at all. The purpose of the billboard was simply to let the atheists who are in Utah know that there are other atheists out there. They're not alone, as the message says.
Okay. I'm going to open up the phone lines one more time. I realize that we're speaking on some deep subjects tonight, but if you'd like to join in the conversation, the phone number here is 801-973-8820. We have with us Jason Cooperrider. He is a board member of the Humanist of Utah and also the Utah Coalition of Reason. Well, let's shift gears here. I started to go down this road, and it's in this kind of dialogue, especially on matters like this, it's hard sometimes to keep a focus. If there's no objective standard for morality, then how do you know that there's an objective standard for knowing what's real?
Well, you've had a host of philosophers talking about this topic, ranging from Descartes, and so there are wide-ranging opinions about how that might be known or not known.
Well, I mean, René Descartes, 17th century philosopher, tries to argue for a rationalistic basis of epistemology, how we know what we know. And instead of starting with God's revealed word, he starts with what he knows, starts with himself. But most people don't realize that after saying cogito ergo sum, you can do the hard G if you want to do the classic pronunciation, but I think, therefore I am. He ends up having to appeal to theistic arguments to be able to get himself out of the box, to know that he knows he exists, but how does he know that anything around him is real? And Descartes, who opens the door to this human-based epistemology, he's a theist. So how do you know? I mean, so many people, they appeal to Descartes, but they don't know what Descartes said, and they just assume that there's actually a rational basis for knowing truth apart from God. But how do you know?
Well, so first of all, I'm going to state clearly I'm not a philosopher by any means, and that was probably evidenced by my ignorance about some of the topics you brought up earlier. But as far as how you can know anything about reality objectively beyond the fact that you exist, I don't know necessarily that you can say there is. I think there probably isn't much point to doing much of anything if you don't make some assumptions about the nature of reality and take the Hume route and base your philosophy on empiricism and your senses. I think that's about all we can do.
But now you're studying neuroscience, and you have you were a double major in your bachelor program in psychology and neuroscience. Are there brute facts that are uninterpreted in the world? Or do we not interpret the facts based on our own paradigm?
Can you restate that? I'm not quite sure what you're getting at.
Sure. Thomas Kuhn wrote a famous book on the history of science back in 1964 called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. Most atheists I've encountered, and granted, these are more of the pop atheist types, but most of them have a very positivist view of science. That you start with point A and you're moving upward all the time, filling in with naturalistic explanations the whole world around us.
Yes, and I do consider myself a positivist.
But now, Kuhn argued very persuasively to many scientists that that's not the history of science at all. That what we have are paradigms. He's the one who coined the term paradigm shift. That we have a way of looking at the world. And I fear that we're about to lose an audience here. So let's try to keep it simple. But basically, we have a way of looking at the world, paradigm. And we function within that paradigm, and we tend to ignore the things that don't fit in that paradigm.
Human nature, sure.
And what we have is eventually a new paradigm will come along. So we replace Ptolemaic astronomy with Copernican, which gets replaced with Newtonian, which gets replaced by Einstein. And rather than this being a straight line, a positivist thing where we're filling in the gaps, and we only rely on God explaining things that we don't have a naturalistic explanation for yet. Instead, it's a whole new worldview, and that none of them can really explain the world that we're in any objective basis of truth. It just explains water boils at 100 degrees Celsius at sea level, every time we do it so far, but it doesn't mean that there's any basis on which we can assume that it's going to happen tomorrow.
Okay.
How do you know what's true?
Well, as I said, you just have to base what you believe to be true on, or at least the naturalistic perspective would be on empirical evidence, evidence we gain through the senses. You can't really make much more of a claim beyond that.
I want to flesh that out some more. One quick question before we go to our first call. Would you admit that empiricism is based on presuppositions that cannot be proved?
I think it's based on the assumption that we've been talking about all along, that you actually can gain true knowledge about reality.
And you're assuming that what you are perceiving is real?
Yes.
Would you go so far as to say that these presuppositions are matters of faith that cannot be proved?
Well, I think there's just really not much basis on thinking otherwise. You don't make progress if you don't hold that position.
The point I'm basically trying to pull out is so many times you have people argue, well, you have faith and I have reason. But their supposed reason, their empiricism, is based on presuppositions that can't be proved. And that doesn't mean that every presupposition is necessarily true, but there are no brute facts that we can all say, yes, these are uninterpreted, and we know that this is objectively true.
Yeah. Well, I don't think you're going to find any scientist out there who's going to say science is perfect, but at least in my opinion and the opinion of many atheists, it's the best we have for procuring knowledge.
But can the scientific method really give us truth? Or can it simply, is it a method of reasoning? It seems as if there's a disjuncture between the real scientific method and matters of faith that have been cloaked in a guise of science, a religion that uses scientific terminology to define things that are just as much a leap of faith as anything else.
I really don't see that position holding. I know there are quite a few theists out there who do hold that science is as much a religion as any.
No, we don't have time to. Basically, it's not science as a whole. It is that there is legitimate science that is falsifiable, mm-hmm. that is objectively testable.
Yes.
And then there are assertions that are wrapped up in scientific language and argumentation that are not really falsifiable, not really testable, and yet they are put forward with the same certainty as things that are.
Can you give an example of that?
Darwinism is an example. Darwinism is put forward as indisputable fact, and it is something that is not falsifiable. The fossil record has not proven to play out the way that Darwin anticipated. It has been basically whatever comes along is put forward as evidence for Darwinism. Even when Darwin gave objective evidences of, here are the things that will prove or support my theory, and many of them have not turned out to be that way. But we end up with people arguing that because they state something wrapped in scientific language, it's objectively knowable as true.
Well, I think the type of assertions you're talking about would be referred to as pseudoscience.
I agree.
Because science should be falsifiable. And I'm not sure I agree with you that Darwinism, or as I would prefer to call it, evolution by natural selection.
It's so much more fun to call it Darwinism.
I'm sure. That it's not falsifiable. I mean, there are quite a number of ways that you could falsify Darwinian theory.
I'm curious, have you read Michael Behe's Darwin's Black Box?
I haven't.
Okay. We'll talk some more. I want to squeeze in.
Sure.
We have with us Connie from South Ogden. Connie, good to have you with us.
Thank you. I just have a question for your guest.
Okay.
I'd like to ask him if there are no moral absolutes and all truth is relative to what one personally believes, then human moral standards are not only subjective, but plural by definition. Having a plurality of moral humanistic standards by definition are in reality nothing more than a collection of human opinions and therefore do not qualify to be defined as moral. I'd like to know if he agrees.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah, so thank you for your question, Connie. I would agree that that would in fact be what what you would call the morality. I don't agree that you couldn't call it morality just because it's based on opinion. I think you're distinguishing between opinion and subjective morality on a basis I'm not quite sure I understand. But in fact, in a society, it would be simply a collection of individual subjective moralities that would then be composited into the society's subjective morality.
I'm curious to flesh this out. A lot of different things I'd love to ask you, but we're running out of time here. And I apologize, we had a caller earlier we weren't able to get to in time. But why is it, you seem to speak favorably of democracy. Why is democracy better than tyranny?
Well, I think we could have a whole discussion on that alone. But I think with democracies, you have an inherent protection of the rights of minorities, whereas you don't with what's that?
So what?
Well, I think that's what makes it better than tyranny. I think the majority of humans would subjectively value that.
But that's a personal opinion. That's not an objective standard. Why would you impose that on a tyrant? If you have a tyrant in charge, mm-hmm. Why should you oppose his tyranny?
Well, your subjective values don't align with his tyrannical values.
So?
Or her.
By what right do you impose your feelings on his feelings?
Well, by the right any human has to want to pursue his or her subjective values.
But there is no right when there is no objective morality, there's no right.
Well, when I say the right, I mean each individual's basis for subjective values. They're going to pursue that because that's what makes him or her happy. That's not going to stop just because a tyrant might say he or she doesn't want you to have those subjective values.
But all you can offer is, I would prefer things to be this way, but I have no basis on which to say this is wrong or this is right. Democracy is something that you would say is utilitarian in bringing about what you desire. But it doesn't have any. But there's no basis on which to say it's right or wrong.
I don't see how that's necessarily relevant. I mean, if a group of people share some subjective value, they're going to act in order to make sure that they can continue pursuing that subjective value.
How do you defend yourself against a mob?
What are you asking?
I'm not clear. How do you defend yourself against a mob? What happens when the majority comes against you?
Well,
what if the world collectively says that a certain group of people should no longer exist? The settlers in Tasmania decided to obliterate the natives, and they were the majority, especially after they killed everyone.
Mm-hmm. Well, the minority could do what it has to do in order to survive. They could just lay down and let the majority do what they're going to do. Hopefully the global society would be more aligned in its subjective values with the minority and would act against the majority, persecuting the minority in that case.
We only have a couple minutes left. I know many of the people would probably be curious about this. What do you make of the claims? I know we don't have time to flesh this out in terms of, without just dismissing religion in general. In the Bible, you have a host of very specific prophecies pertaining to the coming of Jesus Christ. And even the most liberal scholars have to admit they're written hundreds of years prior to the event. We have people who believe that those were fulfilled, were prepared to seal that with their life. What's your opinion of that kind of argumentation? I mean, I realize I'm only touching on just the bare minimum, and you got 30 seconds to respond.
Okay. Well, I'd say if these supposed prophecies really could be substantiated by empirical evidence, then there would be reason to follow your beliefs in the prophecy and act on them, and I would say that would make sense, but I would say most likely they've been left up to interpretation, and people are interpreting the facts to see what they want to see in those cases, most likely.
Have you read the Bible in its entirety?
No, I haven't.
Okay. All right. Well, Mr. Cooper Ryder, very nice to have you with us. I have enjoyed the conversation. I'm just frustrated that we don't have more time to go down these roads, but thank you so much for being with us.
It was great to be here. Thank you.
If you would like more information, you can contact us through our website at www.christpres.net or through the show's website, ancientpaths.tv. The show is sponsored by Christ Presbyterian Church. We are a congregation of the Orthodox Presbyterian denomination. We believe the Bible is the Word of God. It's our only infallible rule of faith and practice. We worship Sunday mornings at 11 a.m., Sunday evenings at 5:30 p.m. at 8630 West, 2700 South. We have a sister congregation in Ogden, Berean Presbyterian Church. They meet at 9 a.m. at 3350 Harrison Boulevard. We also have a mission work in Utah County. If you would like more information, you can go to the websites as I mentioned, or you can give us a call at 801-969-7948. That's 801-969-7948. We invite you to worship with us soon. We try to stress biblical, God-centered worship and biblical preaching and the historic faith once delivered to the saints. We believe that we are sinners saved by grace alone, through faith alone, in Christ alone. Until next week, we wish you God's blessings. Good night.